It's 3:17 a.m. in a secure facility in Washington, D.C. The lights are dim, and the walls are lined with digital screens displaying shifting conflict maps, heat signatures of instability, cascading probabilities of war, and real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe. A team of analysts hunches over a central table, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of data models running complex simulations. This isn't the Pentagon. It isn't Langley. This is the somewhat ironically named United States Institute of Peace. And tonight they're running a war game. The exercise in play is a geopolitical crisis simulation, one of many USIP conducts to forecast the future of global conflicts. The scenario: the administration has decided to lift all remaining sanctions on Russia in a dramatic attempt to reset relations. In parallel, it is scaling back NATO presence in Eastern Europe to signal goodwill. The White House believes this will transform Moscow from an adversary into a cooperative partner, reducing tensions and creating new economic opportunities. On the surface, it sounds like peace. But USIP's job isn't to believe in narratives, it's to model reality. The analysts begin feeding in the data: historical precedents, economic dependencies, Kremlin behavior patterns, intelligence intercepts on Russian strategic thinking. They cross-reference previous case studies, compare game theory models, and analyze the response curves of adversaries to past US de-escalation attempts. The results come in. Probability of Russia interpreting de-escalation as weakness, 87%. Likelihood of Russian military operations expanding in Ukraine or the Baltics within 18 months, 74%. Risk of NATO allies losing trust in US security commitments and seeking alternative defense strategies, 91%. The model is clear. Rather than reducing conflict, the policy shift will likely embolden Russia, leading to aggressive territorial expansion and weakening of the NATO alliance. This report won't dictate policy. USIP doesn't make decisions. They produce the intelligence that others use to make them. Their findings will be sent up the chain to Congress, to the Pentagon, to the White House itself. Whether the administration listens is another matter entirely. To the casual observer, especially one who only knows about USIP from eye-rolling cable news hosts dismissing it as a woke bureaucracy, this might sound like a contradiction. The United States Institute of Peace runs war games. It analyzes military conflicts. It produces risk assessments that directly shape national security policy. Yes, because peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the strategic management of it. USIP is not some naive idealist outpost preaching world harmony. It is in practice a critical component of US military and diplomatic strategy. It functions like a national security think tank, but with a singular focus: preventing unnecessary wars, mitigating conflicts before they escalate, and ensuring that when America acts, it does so with the clearest possible understanding of the consequences. USIP games out wars so we don't have to fight them. It identifies risks before they become crises. It advises military commanders, intelligence agencies, and policymakers on the unseen dangers lurking beneath the surface of global events. This is why every administration, Republican or Democrat, has relied on its analysis. It is why the Pentagon, the State Department, and even field commanders in conflict zones have used USIP's data to guide strategy. On March 18, 2025, federal agents from the FBI and DC Police, acting under orders from the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, entered the headquarters of the United States Institute of Peace, USIP. Staff were ordered to vacate immediately. Senior leadership was forcibly removed, and employees were barred from re-entering the building. By noon, USIP was under full executive control. The White House framed the takeover as an administrative restructuring, arguing that USIP had become inefficient and required direct oversight to align with the administration's strategic vision. However, USIP is a congressionally chartered but independent 501(c)(3) entity, not a federal agency, raising immediate legal and constitutional concerns about the operation's legitimacy. No prior warnings or transition plans were issued, making this an abrupt, forceful occupation rather than a bureaucratic reorganization. The central question remains: why USIP? Unlike military intelligence agencies, USIP has no operational power. It does not deploy troops, command resources, or dictate policy. Its primary role is analysis, conflict modeling, and strategic forecasting, producing independent assessments that inform policymakers, Congress, and international partners. If the administration moved this aggressively to seize control, it suggests that USIP possessed or was about to publish intelligence that directly threatened the White House's geopolitical agenda. The immediate effect of the takeover was the total collapse of USIP's independent function. All active assessments, internal reports, and scenario models were now under administration control. Staff were not reassigned, but physically barred from access, indicating that the White House did not seek institutional reform. It sought institutional erasure. This mirrors historical cases where intelligence agencies were not abolished, but co-opted to serve a specific agenda. Unlike Stalin's purges or Saddam's internal spying networks, this operation followed the Office of Special Plans, OSP model. Rather than destroying USIP, the administration simply took its name, credibility, and infrastructure while gutting its independence. Future reports issued under the USIP brand would now reflect only the administration's position, giving politically driven intelligence a veneer of institutional legitimacy. At a systemic level, this maneuver sends a chilling message across the national security and intelligence community. If a congressionally mandated independent conflict analysis institution can be seized overnight, then no analytical body is safe from political interference. Analysts across multiple agencies, including the State Department, Pentagon, and intelligence services, will likely self-censor moving forward, fearing similar actions if their findings contradict administration policy. The long-term consequence is a cascade of silence where critical intelligence is either suppressed or tailored to fit political narratives. With USIP neutralized, the United States has lost one of its primary independent voices on conflict risk assessment. The takeover does not merely alter one institution's reporting, it removes a vital external check on national security decision-making. USIP frequently provided scenario modeling that challenged optimistic political narratives, offering hard data on conflict escalation risks, diplomatic failures, and adversary intentions. Now, that function is gone. The immediate risk is policy miscalculation. If USIP had intelligence contradicting White House initiatives, such as diplomatic overtures to adversaries or underestimating conflict escalation risks, those warnings are now silenced. Allied governments that previously relied on USIP's independent analysis may now question U.S. intelligence integrity, weakening diplomatic credibility. Congress, which used USIP reports to balance executive claims, will now receive only administration-approved assessments. The long-term danger is strategic blindness. Historically, regimes that suppress intelligence independence do not recognize emerging threats until it is too late. By eliminating a source of objective analysis, the administration has created an information vacuum, increasing the likelihood of costly foreign policy miscalculations, military overreach, and diplomatic failures. If unchecked, this action could fundamentally alter how intelligence is controlled, shaped, and weaponized in the United States. With the entire conflict analysis apparatus of USIP now under White House control, every level of intelligence consumption, from Congress to international partners to military leadership, is now entirely dependent on an administration-controlled intelligence pipeline. The difference between good policy and catastrophic miscalculation often lies in the integrity of the intelligence used to shape decisions. By compromising USIP's independent function, the administration has ensured that the risks it does not want to acknowledge will never be formally assessed, leading the nation into a future shaped by unchallenged assumptions and strategic blindness. USIP provided high-fidelity conflict escalation models that combined historical data, adversary doctrine analysis, and wargame simulations to assess how crises could evolve beyond their initial stages. The primary consumers of these reports were the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the National Security Council, NSC, and the State Department, all of whom relied on these independent assessments to temper executive claims about the stability of U.S. strategic positions. The loss of this function directly impacts congressional oversight of military interventions, diplomatic engagement strategies, and executive claims about de-escalation feasibility. Without USIP's independent modeling, the administration now controls the full narrative on escalation risks, meaning that Congress has no external validation when evaluating claims about potential military conflicts. If USIP had previously projected that a particular action, such as reducing NATO presence in Eastern Europe or unilaterally negotiating with China, could lead to increased adversary aggression rather than de-escalation, that analysis is now entirely at the discretion of the executive branch. NSC officials who once used USIP's assessments to argue against reckless policies will find that the only available escalation models now come from politically influenced sources. The absence of external risk modeling makes it easier for the administration to downplay the risks of war while making it harder for dissenting policymakers to prove otherwise. USIP's conflict escalation models were critical for coordinating multilateral military strategies, particularly with NATO, Five Eyes intelligence partners, and regional security alliances. These simulations helped align U.S. military posture with Allied forces, ensuring that responses to crises in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific were informed by shared evidence-based projections rather than isolated national perspectives. By providing an independent, politically neutral assessment, USIP helped prevent allies from overreacting or underestimating threats, establishing a common risk framework that shaped collective deterrence and defense strategies. Now, with USIP's conflict escalation assessments controlled by the administration, Allied forces are no longer assured of the reliability of U.S. risk assessments. If the administration downplays escalation risks to justify unilateral de-escalation with Russia or China, NATO partners may perceive the U.S. as either withholding intelligence or manipulating risk assessments for political ends. This could lead to fractures in NATO's threat perception, with some members adopting more aggressive stances while others become more cautious, eroding the alliance's cohesion. Over time, U.S. military influence will weaken, as allies increasingly rely on their own intelligence assessments rather than trusting Washington's leadership in collective defense planning. USIP maintained detailed adversary response models that analyzed how key global powers, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, would react to shifts in U.S. military posture, sanctions policies, or diplomatic overtures. These reports were used by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the House Intelligence Committee, and the Pentagon, who leveraged them as a counterbalance to classified intelligence that sometimes contained internal biases. With USIP's adversary response forecasting now under administration control, the executive branch can selectively present intelligence that aligns with its preferred policy choices, distorting risk assessments of adversary actions. Previously, if intelligence officials warned that Russia would perceive U.S. withdrawal from a key strategic region as weakness, USIP's independent analysis could reinforce that assessment, making it harder for the administration to dismiss. Now, adversary response forecasts will be filtered through the administration's internal intelligence apparatus, which means that risks associated with appeasement, overreach, or strategic miscalculations could be understated or exaggerated based on political goals rather than empirical modeling. This directly impacts Pentagon strategy, as military planners will now have fewer independent sources verifying adversary threat levels, increasing the likelihood of strategic errors that either provoke unnecessary confrontation or fail to anticipate hostile moves. USIP's adversary response forecasting played a crucial role in coordinating multilateral sanctions, diplomatic pressure campaigns, and deterrence strategies. The European Union, G7, and Indo-Pacific Quad partners, Japan, India, Australia, relied on these models to predict how nations like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea would react to joint punitive actions. These forecasts balanced economic, military, and diplomatic interests, ensuring that sanctions or deterrence measures were neither too weak to be ineffective nor too aggressive to provoke unnecessary escalation. With USIP's forecasting now politicized, international partners will doubt the credibility of U.S. risk assessments, making coordinated sanctions far more difficult. If the administration falsely downplays the likelihood of Russian retaliation to justify diplomatic normalization, European allies may hesitate to impose sanctions, fearing they're being manipulated into taking economic risks the U.S. itself is not taking seriously. Conversely, if adversary response forecasts overestimate threats to justify increased military spending or trade restrictions, allies may resist U.S. pressure, seeing it as an attempt to distort intelligence for domestic political gains. Over time, this erosion of trust will force allies to bypass U.S. intelligence assessments entirely, leading to fragmented, inconsistent policies that weaken the effectiveness of collective deterrence efforts. USIP provided long-term analyses of fragile states, mapping conditions that could lead to civil wars, insurgencies, or total state collapse well before they reached a crisis point. These assessments were used by USAID, the Senate Appropriations Committee, and the U.S. delegation to the United Nations, all of whom depended on them to determine where stabilization funding and diplomatic interventions were most needed. With USIP under direct administration control, these assessments can now be tailored to justify shifting aid priorities or downplay instability risks that conflict with White House foreign policy goals. Previously, if a USIP report warned that sudden withdrawal of aid from a fragile state would accelerate its collapse, that analysis could be used by USAID or the Senate to push back against funding cuts. Now, if the administration wishes to justify diverting resources away from one region to favor another, it can suppress findings that contradict its policy choices. The absence of independent stability assessments could lead to delayed responses to emerging crises, as aid groups and international partners lose access to accurate risk projections. This is particularly dangerous in regions where instability can quickly lead to terrorist safe havens, mass refugee displacement, or failed states that require far more costly military intervention later. USIP's stability assessments were a cornerstone of international humanitarian aid and security cooperation, particularly with organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, and USAID, as well as U.S. allies engaged in development assistance. These reports help target humanitarian aid, preempt refugee crises, and coordinate global responses to emerging civil wars. U.S. partners used these independent analyses to determine when to fund stabilization efforts, when to mediate conflicts, and when to prepare for mass displacement events. Now, with USIP under administration control, fragile state warnings may be manipulated to align with political narratives, leading to aid misallocation and delayed responses to emerging crises. If the White House downplays instability risks to justify cutting foreign aid, allies who rely on U.S. assessments may also withhold funding, only realizing too late that a crisis has escalated beyond control. Conversely, if reports exaggerate instability risks to justify intervention, allied governments may resist U.S. leadership in humanitarian coordination, suspecting that U.S. intelligence is shaping the narrative to push military involvement over diplomatic solutions. The long-term impact is global paralysis in humanitarian and stabilization efforts, increasing the frequency of failed states, unmanageable refugee crises, and insurgency-driven conflicts that spiral beyond Western control. USIP provided structured post-conflict governance frameworks, outlining how to stabilize war-torn nations, reintegrate factions, and establish functional governments after U.S. interventions. These reports were essential for the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department, and NATO, ensuring that post-war transitions were planned before military operations concluded. With this function now subject to administration oversight, there is a greater risk of post-war instability due to politically motivated governance planning rather than strategic necessity. Historically, Failures in post-conflict governance, such as the lack of planning after the Iraq invasion, have led to insurgent resurgence, prolonged instability, and costly U.S. re-engagement. USIP's independent governance models prevented such failures by ensuring realistic assessments of which factions could effectively govern and what political structures were viable. Now, if the administration seeks to rush an intervention without a proper exit strategy, it can suppress governance planning reports that highlight flaws in post-war reconstruction efforts. This would leave the military without a clear roadmap for stabilization, increasing the likelihood of prolonged occupation insurgency or a power vacuum that adversaries can exploit. USIP's governance planning provided a crucial roadmap for post-war recovery and reconstruction, ensuring that U.S. military interventions did not end in prolonged instability or insurgency resurgence. These frameworks were critical for NATO post-war missions, U.S. State Department nation-building programs, and allied peacekeeping efforts, helping ensure that democratic transitions and stabilization strategies were realistic, locally supported, and internationally coordinated. By offering an independent, research-based approach, USIP helped prevent political bias from shaping post-war governance structures, avoiding disastrous mistakes like Iraq's de-Baathification, which fueled insurgency. With the administration now controlling USIP's governance planning, future post-conflict strategies risk being shaped by ideological preferences rather than ground realities. If post-war assessments are distorted to justify premature withdrawal or hand-picked leadership appointments, allied partners engaged in reconstruction may reject U.S. plans as unreliable, pushing for their own governance frameworks instead. This will reduce U.S. influence in post-war transitions, leading to either governance vacuums that fuel extremist resurgence or power struggles, where international partners compete over conflicting stabilization plans. Over time, the U.S. will lose credibility as a leader in post-war governance, forcing allies to seek alternative coalitions or multilateral approaches that diminish U.S. authority in shaping global order. USIP conducted peace negotiation feasibility assessments determining which diplomatic efforts had real potential for success versus those that were political theater. These reports were critical to State Department special envoys, the National Security Advisor, and UN peacekeeping missions, ensuring that the U.S. did not waste time and credibility on negotiations that were destined to fail. With the administration now controlling USIP's peace analysis, there is a heightened risk that failed negotiations will be pursued for political gain, or that viable negotiations will be dismissed due to ideological bias. Previously, if USIP determined that a proposed ceasefire agreement was likely to collapse due to bad faith actors, its findings could prevent the U.S. from entering negotiations that would ultimately strengthen adversaries. Conversely, if USIP concluded that a diplomatic settlement was viable but did not align with White House priorities, the administration would have a harder time dismissing it outright. Now, peace feasibility assessments will reflect whatever narrative best serves political interests, increasing the likelihood that the U.S. engages in negotiations that fail spectacularly or rejects viable opportunities for de-escalation based on manipulated intelligence. USIP's peace negotiation feasibility assessments ensured that U.S.-led diplomatic efforts were grounded in reality rather than political optics. These reports helped the United Nations, European Union, and U.S. special envoys determine which ceasefire agreements, peace deals, or diplomatic summits had real potential for success. By offering a non-partisan assessment of whether warring factions were negotiating in good faith, USIP helped prevent diplomatic failures that emboldened hostile actors while ensuring that real opportunities for peace were not dismissed due to political bias. Now, with peace negotiation feasibility reports subject to White House control, the credibility of U.S. mediation will suffer immediate and lasting damage. If the administration promotes a peace deal that is politically convenient but structurally unsound, allies may refuse to support it, fearing it is designed to serve U.S. interests rather than secure lasting stability. Conversely, if a legitimate peace deal is dismissed because it does not align with administration narratives, international partners may pursue diplomatic efforts independently, sidelining the U.S. from critical negotiations. The long-term effect is a loss of U.S. diplomatic authority, as both allies and adversaries recognize that American mediation efforts are now driven by domestic political considerations rather than objective conflict resolution. The sudden takeover of the United States Institute of Peace, USIP, presents a fundamental challenge to the integrity of intelligence assessments, forcing security teams to critically reevaluate how intelligence objectivity and independence shape strategic decision-making. Teams must examine carefully how the abrupt politicization of previously reliable conflict modeling and scenario forecasting could degrade the accuracy and trustworthiness of intelligence products. Understanding precisely how political interference reshapes intelligence content and identifying clear indicators of compromised analysis will be crucial for accurately gauging the depth and scale of this vulnerability. Moreover, teams should consider how the loss of USIP's independent voice may distort strategic decision-making across the highest levels of government. Without objective, evidence-based intelligence, decisions on diplomatic engagement, military deployments, and conflict resolution risk being influenced by political bias rather than reality-based assessment. Analysts must therefore determine how the absence of impartial assessments previously provided by USIP might lead policymakers toward significant miscalculations, potentially resulting in unchecked escalation, misguided intervention, or the inadvertent neglect of emerging threats. The international dimension of this vulnerability is equally critical. Security teams must assess how compromised intelligence credibility could erode trust among allies and international partners. A perception that U.S. assessments are politically manipulated rather than analytically rigorous could weaken cooperation in multilateral security arrangements, undermine coordinated responses to emerging crises, and encourage adversaries to exploit these new gaps in credibility. Evaluating how adversarial nations might respond strategically, potentially by testing alliance cohesion or escalating conflicts, is vital to fully understanding the ramifications of diminished international trust. Ultimately, security teams tasked with analyzing this scenario must consider not only the immediate effects of losing USIP's independence, but also the cascading consequences across domestic institutions, allied relationships, and adversarial behaviors. Clearly articulating these vulnerabilities, without assuming prescribed solutions, will allow policymakers and strategic leaders to better understand and navigate the potentially severe consequences of an intelligence environment shaped by political interference rather than objective reality.